As many of you will already know, the British Museum has embarked on a journey to renovate its public spaces. The majestic neoclassical building designed by Sir Robert Merck 200 years ago is struggling to cope with the demands of the 6 million visitors that pass through those narrow doors each year. A new visitor welcome center will be located in this area to replace the crude and inadequate tents used for security screening. But the very first renovation, and probably the most impactful for the image of this iconic museum, will happen here, in the so-called Western Range. This is where artifacts such as the Rosetta Stone and the Elgin Marbles are kept, alongside most of the Assyrian and Egyptian sculpture collections. What will the future of these spaces be? Today, I want to share a few ideas with you, just after the intro.
The international competition to establish the vision for this first chunk of this massive £1 billion renovation project already has a winner.
The designs will be penned by French-Lebanese architect Lina Ghotmeh, who has already under her belt projects such as the Estonian National Museum and the Contemporary Art Museum in Alula. The first phase of the competition had the objective of establishing just the principles of this new architectural vision. So the few renders and the maquette Ghotmeh's practice presented give us a tantalizing insight into the future, but nothing more than that. To be perfectly frank, I don't like what I have seen so far. So the question is, what would I like to see? And most importantly for the viewers of this channel, what would I like to see for the Elgin Marbles? One of the most contentious points, and certainly one of the chief reasons for criticism of the current arrangement of the marbles in the Divine Gallery, is that the frieze is presented towards the center of the room. This, while allowing the visitors to wander around from one side to the other as they please, does not reflect the ancient reality of this amazing composition. As we all know, the frieze adorned the external face of the cella's walls, in the inner part of the Parthenon, encircled by the columns. In this position, the viewer would not be able to see all the frieze at once, as it were, but would have had to walk all around the building to follow the narration, going from the southwest corner of all the way towards the east side, and enjoying one portion of the frieze at a time, while looking up between the columns. The idea of lining up all the pieces of a frieze on the wall of the big room was not new, and there are precedents, such as the remarkable frieze of the Pergamon altar in Berlin's Pergamon Museum. The arrangement in Berlin had been put in place in the early 1930s, following a design established 2 decades before by Alfred Messel. John Russell Pope, the American architect tasked in 1931 by Lord Divine with creating the projects for the layout of the Divine Gallery, followed the most up-to-date museological tendencies at the time. This way of displaying the frieze became immediately obsolete after the war, and museum displays today try to reproduce the ancient layout of the work as faithfully as possible. One clear example of this concept, and one that concerns us closely, is the arrangement of the sculptures of the Parthenon that have remained in Athens, now housed in the ultra-modern New Acropolis Museum in the Greek capital. I have many reasons to dislike the Acropolis Museum, most of them related to the ideological premises that guide the display. But they got one thing right when they decided to display the Ionic frieze facing outwards with the blocks lined up on the external face of a central volume. I would love for the new arrangement of the Elgin Marbles to follow the same principle, allowing visitors to walk around the frieze rather than being surrounded by it. Another feature of the display in Athens that I would like to see replicated in London is the presentation of the frieze in its complete, as much as this is possible, and consistent articulation. This is achieved in Athens by interspersing the original pieces with plaster casts of the fragments that are hosted elsewhere, most of them obviously here in London. Since the very first decade of the removal, the British Museum and the Greek government engaged in a very prestigious exchange of plaster casts, in the shared conviction that possessing the full development of the frieze was advantageous for scholars and visitors alike, regardless of whether they were originals or copies. The British Museum still possesses those casts, which have been recently studied by Emma Payne, and it would be great if they could be taken out of the storerooms so that they could once again contribute to a fuller enjoyment of Phidias' masterpiece. In recent years, Roger Michael and his Institute for Digital Archaeology proposed replacing the London-based portion of the Parthenon sculptures with robo-carved, ultra-precise copies in pentelic marble. I don't support this idea, of course, but this doesn't mean that replicas could not be a great addition to the London originals, enabling once again visitors and scholars to enjoy the full cycle in its near complete state. However, the similarities with the Acropolis Museum end here. One of the aspects of the display in Athens I am less happy with is the lighting of the sculptures, which is, both in quality, direction, and above all quantity, fully at odds with the way Phidias wanted this frieze to be consumed. If we look for a moment at the original position of the friezes in the temple, they were actually placed in one of the darkest corners of the entire building, high up on the walls of the cell, where the walls meet the marble trusses of the peristasis. Shielded from direct sunlight by the entablature members, the friezes were never bathed in Arctic sunlight, as many restitution campaigners keep saying. This somewhat hidden position has induced scholars to imagine that the frieze had been dedicated more as an offering to be enjoyed by the gods than a feature designed for the consumption of the wider Athenian public. The way they are displayed now is not ideal, with light coming from the huge roof slice above and shadows being cast under the figures in a way that is the exact opposite of what was envisaged by Phidias. The situation in Athens is even worse, with light bouncing on the sculptures from nearly every direction during the day and coming from spotlights placed above during the night hours. This is a shame, because the level of detail sometimes visible on the underside of these figures is entirely covered by shadows cast by these inappropriate lighting. Ideally, in the new ElginRoom, I would like to see a much more atmospheric kind of lighting, like the one that animates the famous painting by Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema of Phidias illustrating the frieze to Pericles. In this extraordinary painting, one of the many pieces of Western art that have been directly inspired by the Elgin Marbles, Alma-Tadema captures the mood of the scene with dark undertones dominating the higher portion of the canvas and vast amounts of natural light showing from below the scaffolding, mimicking the original lighting condition of the friezes. Talking of heights, the next item on my wish list is more contentious. The frieze should be placed high up, at least for a portion of its length, so that visitors have the opportunity to appreciate it in the way it was supposed to be seen by its creator and the way it has been looked at in the centuries between its creation and the devastating explosion that took it down in 1687. Even today, if you approach the Parthenon from the west, you have the opportunity to get an idea of how difficult it must have been for a regular Athenian to see those details in the composition and in the execution of the sculptures that we today rightly celebrate as one of the crowning achievements of art. Of course, it would be highly impractical and totally useless to just place the entire frieze at the same height as the original, but it would be possible to replicate the original condition, at least for a section of it, maybe with a balcony hidden inside the entablature, to allow visitors to appreciate the portion of the sculpture close up, while others see it from 10 meters below. If you're interested in the visibility condition of the frieze in antiquity, there is a great article by Clemente Marconi that I would like to recommend. The fifth and final item on my list goes in an entirely different direction. So far, we've spoken of the aesthetic characteristics of these sculptures, the way they look, and how they should be presented in order to enable a correct fruition. What I would like is for these items to be perceived not just as a pretty thing, but also as a historical document. The two little galleries that showcase the history and the importance of these items as cultural objects are entirely inadequate. And the fact that most people in the UK and all over the world have a very sketchy understanding of the correct historical circumstances of the acquisition of these marbles is a failure by the museum that badly needs to be addressed. Assuming they will one day display the friezes the right way, the big space in the middle should be used to explain why Elgin did append his entire fortune and career to save the marbles. What was the cultural effect on British and Western art of the marbles being here and the details of how the removal was performed with all the justificative evidence, above all, the Italian translation of the Ferman. Summing up, I just wish for a British museum that is no longer ashamed of displaying the marbles and stops playing hide and seek when it comes to talking about them. There are plenty of stories that these amazing artifacts allow us to tell. We should take full advantage of this opportunity. So there it is, my very exigent wish list of 5 ideas I would like to see included in any project for the new Elgin Room of the British Museum. If you happen to know Lina Ghotmeh and her team, make sure to let them know. That's all for today. See you soon with another episode of Marble Games.